They say that when you dedicate your life to healing others, you forget to heal yourself. For 43 years, I wore the white coat like armor, carried my stethoscope like a sacred talisman, and believed that the Hippocratic oath I'd sworn at 25 would guide me through whatever storms life might bring. First, not harm. Those words became my North Star, my unbreakable promise, not just to my patients, but to the universe itself. My name is Dr. Henry Caldwell, and at 78 years old, I'm finally ready to tell you the truth about what happens when the people you've sacrificed everything for, your devotion, your very life itself, are worth less than the numbers in your bank account. The morning it all began to unravel was a Tuesday in October, crisp and golden like the autumn days Eleanor used to love. I remember because I'd been standing in my kitchen, holding her favorite coffee mug, the one with the tiny chip on the handle that she'd refused to let me throw away for 30 years, and watching the maple leaves outside our window catch the early sunlight like stained glass. The house felt impossibly quiet without her humming, without the soft rustle of newspaper pages as she worked through the crossword puzzle that always stumped her at 7. Eleanor had been gone for 8 months by then, claimed by the same cancer I'd spent decades fighting in other people's bodies. And I was still learning how to exist in a world that suddenly felt too large and too empty all at once. Retirement had been her dream for us, time to travel, to read all those books we'd promised each other we'd get to someday, to simply sit together on the porch swing she'd picked out and watch the seasons change without the constant interruption of pagers and emergency calls and patients who needed me more than my family ever seemed to. But Eleanor never got to see that retirement. The diagnosis came 6 months after I'd finally hung up my white coat for the last time. And suddenly, all those dreams of leisurely mornings and afternoon naps evaporated like morning mist. Instead of traveling, we spent our time in oncology waiting rooms that smelled of disinfectant and despair. Instead of reading novels, we read treatment options and insurance forms and living wills. Instead of growing old together, I watched the woman I'd loved for 45 years grow thin and pale and brave, in ways that broke my heart daily. I fought for her the way I'd fought for countless patients over the decades. I called in favors with specialists across 3 states, researched experimental treatments until my eyes burned from staring at medical journals, and even considered flying her to Switzerland for a procedure that might have bought us a few more months together. But in the end, cancer doesn't care how many lives you've saved, or how much medical knowledge you've accumulated, or how desperately you need just a little more time. Eleanor died on a Thursday morning in March, holding my hand and whispering that she was proud of the man I'd become, proud of the lives I'd saved, proud of the children we'd raised together. Her last words to me were about our family, about how she knew I'd be okay because I had Richard and Susan, our 2 beautiful children, who would take care of their father the way he'd always taken care of everyone else. I believed her. God help me, I believed every word. Richard was 43 then, a successful investment banker in Chicago with a corner office and a BMW, and a wife named Cheryl who wore designer clothes and spoke about people's worth in terms of their net value. He'd inherited Eleanor's quick mind, but somehow missed her compassionate heart. Though I'd convinced myself over the years that his coldness was just the armor successful people wore in the business world, surely underneath that calculated exterior beat the heart of a little boy who used to beg me to let him listen to his own heartbeat through my stethoscope, who would bandage his teddy bears and declare he wanted to be just like Daddy when he grew up. Susan was 38, a corporate lawyer in Boston who'd married another lawyer and produced 2 beautiful grandchildren. I saw perhaps 3 times a year if I was lucky. She'd always been the more emotional of my 2 children, the one who cried over injured birds and insisted on keeping every stray cat that wandered into our yard. But somewhere between law school and partnership track, that tender-hearted girl had been replaced by someone who spoke in billable hours and strategic advantages. Someone who looked at problems in terms of risks and benefits rather than simple human decency. They both came to Eleanor's funeral, of course. Richard flew in from Chicago with Cheryl, both dressed in expensive black that somehow managed to look more like a business meeting than a goodbye to the woman who'd given them life. Susan arrived with her husband, Paul, and the grandchildren, though the kids seemed more interested in their phones than in comforting their grieving grandfather. For 3 days, my house filled with the sounds of family again. Richard and Cheryl took over the guest bedroom, spreading their papers and laptops across Eleanor's antique writing desk like they were establishing a temporary branch office. Susan and her family crowded into the converted basement. The children complaining about the Wi-Fi and the lack of cable television while their parents held whispered conversations in the laundry room. I should have seen the signs then. The way Richard's eyes kept calculating the value of Eleanor's jewelry collection when he thought I wasn't looking. The way Susan photographed the artwork we'd collected over the years, claiming she wanted to preserve memories, but she spent an awful lot of time researching auction values on her phone. The way both of them kept steering conversations toward my health, my energy levels, and my ability to maintain such a large house all by myself. But grief is a strange blindfold. It makes you see only what you need to see, hear only what you need to hear. I needed to believe that my children loved me, that the 43 years I'd spent sacrificing for my patients had been balanced by the love and devotion I'd poured into raising them. I needed to believe that Eleanor's last words had been prophecy rather than hope, that I really would be okay because I had them. The funeral was beautiful, exactly what Eleanor would have wanted. The church overflowed with people whose lives she'd touched, former patients who remembered her gentle voice in my office, neighbors she'd helped through crises, friends from the garden club and book club, and dozens of committees she'd joined over the years. The pastor spoke about her kindness, her strength, her unwavering faith in the goodness of people. He talked about the marriage we'd built together, the family we'd raised, the legacy of love we'd created that would endure long after we were both gone. I sat in the front pew, between my children, and felt something like peace settle over me. This was what a life well lived looked like, hundreds of people gathering to celebrate a woman who'd made the world better simply by existing in it. This was what I'd worked toward for all those years, all those nights away from home, all those missed dinners and school plays and family vacations. I'd been building something lasting, something that would outlive both Eleanor and me. After the service, as we stood in the cemetery where Eleanor was laid to rest beside the small headstone that marked our firstborn son taken by SIDS when he was just 3 months old, a loss that had nearly destroyed us both but somehow made us stronger in the end. Richard put his arm around my shoulders in a gesture that felt both comforting and possessive. "We need to talk about what comes next," he said, his voice carrying the same tone he probably used with clients who needed to make difficult financial decisions. "You can't stay in that big house all by yourself. It's not practical, and frankly, it's not safe." "I'm fine, son," I replied, though my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. "The house is where your mother and I built our life together. It's where I need to be." Susan appeared at my other side, her face arranged in an expression of concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Daddy, we love you, and that's why we're worried. You're 78 years old, and this house has 3 stories, stairs everywhere, rooms you don't even use anymore. What if something happens to you and no one finds you for days?" They were using Eleanor's own arguments, the same gentle pressure she'd started applying in the months before her diagnosis. The irony was sharp enough to cut. My wife had wanted me to consider downsizing because she dreamed of us growing old together, in a cozy condo somewhere warm, maybe Florida or Arizona, where we could walk on the beach and read books under palm trees. My children wanted me to downsize because they saw dollar signs in every square foot of the Victorian mansion Eleanor and I had restored together. Over 30 years of weekends and vacations, we've done some research, Richard continued, pulling out his phone to show me a professionally designed website. Sunset Gardens is one of the finest senior living communities in the state. Independent living units for people who don't need assistance, but with medical staff on call 24 hours a day. Activities, social opportunities, and meal plans. Dad, you'd probably love it once you gave it a chance. Looked at the glossy photos on his screens, elderly people playing cards and tending small gardens and participating in what looked like forced merriment. Everything was clean and organized and efficiently designed to keep people like me busy until we died quietly and conveniently, without causing too much trouble for our families. "I'll think about it," I said, the same phrase I'd been using to deflect difficult conversations for decades. When patients asked if they were dying, when residents questioned my treatment decisions, and when Eleanor suggested we take a vacation, I knew I couldn't afford to take away from the practice. "I'll think about it" had become my default response to any situation that required more emotional energy than I had available to give. But thinking, as it turned out, wasn't what my children had in mind. Over the following weeks, as the parade of casseroles and condolence cards gradually slowed and I began the lonely process of learning to live alone, Richard and Susan maintained a steady campaign of concern. Phone calls every few days, always checking on my health, my eating habits, my social interactions. Did I remember to take my medications? Was I getting enough sleep? Had I considered joining any senior groups in town? At first, their attention felt like love. After months of watching Eleanor fade away, after the exhaustion of funeral preparations and estate settlements, it was almost comforting to have someone checking on me regularly. But gradually, I began to notice that every conversation seemed designed to highlight my vulnerabilities, to catalog evidence that I couldn't take care of myself properly. "Dad, Mrs. Henderson next door called me," Susan said during one of these calls. "She's worried because she saw you outside in your pajamas getting the newspaper at noon on Sunday." I remembered that day clearly. I'd had trouble sleeping, another side effect of grief. I was still learning to navigate and had finally dozed off around dawn. When I woke up at 11:30, I stumbled outside to get the paper without thinking about my attire. It was hardly a sign of dementia or dangerous behavior, just the absent-mindedness of someone adjusting to a completely different routine. "I was tired, sweetheart. Sometimes retired people sleep late and wear comfortable clothes. It's one of the perks." "I know, Daddy, but people are starting to talk. Mrs. Henderson also mentioned that you haven't been keeping up with the yard, work the way you used to." This was true. The elaborate gardens Eleanor had loved, with their carefully tended roses and seasonal flower arrangements, had become a source of grief rather than joy. Every time I looked at the bare spots where her prized peonies used to bloom, every time I passed the herb garden she'd planted so she could cook with fresh basil and thyme, I felt her absence like a physical wound. I'd been paying a lawn service to handle the basics, but I hadn't had the heart to maintain her decorative plantings. "Your mother was the gardener," I said quietly. "I just helped with the heavy lifting. Maybe that's another sign that the house is too much for you to handle alone." The conversations always ended the same way, with gentle suggestions that I consider my options, that I think seriously about making some changes before I was forced to make them under less ideal circumstances. My children spoke about my future with the same clinical detachment I'd once used to discuss treatment options with: terminal, patients, necessary decisions that would be painful but ultimately beneficial for everyone involved. December brought the first real proof of what they were. Planning, I was in my study, the same room where I'd spent countless evenings reviewing patient files and medical journals, reading submissions from younger doctors seeking my consultation on difficult cases. The walls were lined with books and framed diplomas and photographs from my career, me shaking hands with the hospital administrator who'd recruited me fresh out of residency, the staff photo from my first year in practice, images of patients whose lives I'd saved or at least made more comfortable during their final months. The afternoon sunlight was slanting through the window, casting long shadows across Eleanor's reading chair when I heard voices in the front yard. Not unusual in itself, the house sat on a busy street, and neighbors often stopped to chat while walking their dogs or collecting mail. But something about these particular voices made me look up from the medical journal I'd been reading, an old habit from the days when any unexpected sound might signal an emergency that required my attention. Richard was standing near the front gate with a woman I didn't recognize, someone in her 50s wearing a navy business suit and carrying a leather portfolio. They were both looking up at the house, with the kind of professional assessment I'd seen countless times when Eleanor and I had considered various home improvement projects over the years. I moved closer to the window, staying back in the shadows where they couldn't see me, and strained to hear their conversation over the sound of traffic and wind through the bare branches of our old oak tree. "The location is excellent," the woman was saying, her voice crisp and businesslike. "Victorian architecture in this condition is very desirable, especially in this neighborhood, with the right staging and perhaps some minor updates. I think we could easily get asking price, possibly more." Richard nodded, pulling out his phone to take photos of the front facade. "What kind of timeline are we looking at? My father is, well, he's getting older, and we want to make sure he's settled somewhere safe before winter really sets in. If we move quickly, we could have it on the market within a month. These heritage properties tend to sell fast when they're priced correctly. I assume you have power of attorney." "Working on it," Richard replied, and something in his tone made my chest tighten with the first stirring of real alarm. "Dad's been resistant to making practical decisions since my mother died, but we're hoping to help him see reason soon." They were discussing selling my home, the home Eleanor and I had bought as newlyweds, where we'd raised our children, where I'd planned to live out my final years surrounded by 45 years of memories. They were talking about it like I was already dead or incapacitated, like my wishes and feelings were irrelevant obstacles to be overcome through manipulation or legal maneuvering. I watched them walk around the property, the real estate agent pointing out architectural features and lot boundaries, while Richard took notes on his phone. They spent nearly an hour cataloging my life, my memories, my home like it was nothing more than a commodity to be appraised and sold to the highest bidder. After they left, I sat in Eleanor's chair and tried to process what I'd witnessed. This wasn't a conversation between a concerned son and a helpful professional. This was a business meeting between co-conspirators planning to profit from my grief and isolation. The phone rang that evening while I was heating up leftover soup for dinner, another meal, eaten alone at the kitchen table where Eleanor and I had shared thousands of conversations over the decades. The caller ID showed Richard's number, and for a moment I considered not answering. But old habits die hard, and I'd spent 43 years answering phone calls that might signal someone's desperate need for help. "Hi, Dad. How was your day?" The casual friendliness in his voice felt like sandpaper against my raw nerves. "Fine, son. Quiet. That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. Susan and I have been discussing your situation, and we think it's time to make some serious plans. Winter's coming, and we're both worried about you managing that big house all by yourself when the weather gets bad. I've managed fine for 45 years. With Mom's help, yes. But Dad, you're not getting any younger, and neither are we. Susan and I can't keep dropping everything to drive across 3 states every time you need something. It's not fair to any of us, not fair to them." My son was complaining about the inconvenience of occasionally checking on his widowed father, the man who'd worked 70-hour weeks to pay for his education and his sister's, who'd missed countless family gatherings and personal milestones, because other people's medical emergencies took precedence over everything else. "I haven't asked you to drop everything," I said quietly. "I haven't asked you for anything. Maybe not directly, but Dad, you're not thinking clearly about this. What happens when you fall down those stairs? What happens when you have a medical emergency and there's no one around to help? We can't live with that kind of worry hanging over us." Double quotes their worry, their convenience, their peace of mind. Everything was about what they needed, what would make their lives easier, what would allow them to sleep better at night. The man who dedicated his entire career to putting other people's needs first was being lectured about selfishness by the children he'd sacrificed everything to provide for. "I saw you today," I said, the words emerging before I could stop them. "You and a real estate agent." Looking at the house, the silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long I wondered if the call had been dropped. When Richard finally spoke, his voice had lost its artificial warmth. "Dad, we're just exploring options. Susan and I want to make sure we understand what resources are available if and when you decide to make a change." "Resources," I repeated. "Is that what you call my home now?" "A resource. Don't be dramatic. You know, we're only thinking about what's best for you." "Are you?" Because it sounded like you were discussing how to sell my house, whether I agree to it or not. Something about the power of attorney. Another pause, shorter this time, but weighted with something that felt like guilt. "Dad, someone needs to have legal authority to help you make decisions if your judgment becomes ... compromised. It's a standard precaution for people your age." "My judgment is fine, Richard. Is it? Because from where Susan and I sit, you're an elderly widower living alone in a house that's too big for you to maintain, isolating yourself from social contact, refusing to consider practical alternatives that would ensure your safety and well-being. That doesn't sound like fine judgment to me. The clinical language, the detached assessment of my mental state, the casual dismissal of my autonomy, it all felt terrifyingly familiar. I'd had similar conversations with families when their loved ones needed interventions they weren't ready to accept. The difference was that I'd always been genuinely concerned about my patient's welfare, not about my own financial benefit. "I'm not ready to sell the house, son. Maybe not today. But Dad, ready or not, there's going to come a time when you don't have a choice. Wouldn't it be better to make this transition while you're still healthy enough to enjoy your new living situation? Transition, new living situation. The euphemisms rolled off his tongue like he'd been practicing them, like he'd rehearsed this conversation until every word was calculated for maximum emotional impact. After I hung up, I poured myself a glass of Eleanor's favorite wine, a bottle of Chardonnay we'd been saving for a special occasion that never command. Sat in my study trying to understand how I'd raise children capable of such cold manipulation. I thought about all the nights I'd come home exhausted from the hospital to find them waiting up for help with homework or comfort after bad dreams. I remembered teaching Richard to ride a bike, bandaging Susan's scraped knees, and reading bedtime stories until my voice was hoarse from fatigue. Where had I gone wrong? When had their love for me been replaced by calculation and greed? But as I sat there surrounded by the books and diplomas that represented my life's work, I began to realize that maybe the problem wasn't what I'd done wrong as a father. Maybe the problem was that I'd been so focused on being a good doctor that I'd failed to teach my children what goodness actually meant. I'd shown them that success was measured in financial achievements and professional recognition. I'd demonstrated that other people's needs always came first, that personal sacrifice was a virtue, that love meant working yourself to exhaustion for the benefit of others. I'd given them everything they wanted materially, while somehow forgetting to give them the values that would make them worthy of those gifts. And now, in the twilight of my life, I was reaping the harvest of seeds I'd unknowingly planted decades. Earlier, the wine tasted bitter on my tongue as I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. If my children were planning to treat me like a problem to be solved rather than a father to be cherished, then perhaps it was time to start treating them like the adversaries they'd chosen to become. Eleanor had always said, I was too trusting, too willing to assume the best about people even when evidence suggested otherwise. Henry, she used to tell me, your patients lie to you about their symptoms, your colleagues lie to you about their competence, and our children lie to you about cleaning their rooms. When are you going to learn that good people sometimes do bad things when they think no one's watching? I'd thought she was being cynical. Now I realized she'd been preparing me for this moment. The next morning, I called my lawyer. Jonathan Pierce had been handling my legal affairs for 20 years. Ever since the malpractice scare that had nearly destroyed my practice and taught me the importance of having someone competent protecting my interests, he was my age, a grandfather himself. And over the years, our relationship had evolved from purely professional to something approaching friendship. I was sorry to hear about Eleanor, he said when I called to schedule an appointment. She was a remarkable woman. How are you holding up? That's actually what I need to discuss with you. Can you see me this week? Of course. Is everything all right? I hesitated, not sure how to explain that I was seeking legal advice to protect myself from my own children. I need to make some changes to my estate planning, some precautionary measures. Jonathan's voice became more alert, more professional. What kind of precautionary measures? The kind that will protect my assets from people who might try to take advantage of my age or grief to gain control over my affairs. There was a pause, and when Jonathan spoke again, I could hear the concern in his voice. Henry, are we talking about your children? We're talking about protecting myself from anyone who might try to manipulate or coerce me into making decisions that aren't in my best interests. I see. Can you be in my office on Thursday afternoon? This sounds like something we should discuss in person. Jonathan's office occupied the top floor of a historic building downtown, with windows that overlooked the same streets where I'd spent 43 years making house calls and emergency visits. The autumn light streaming through those windows reminded me of countless afternoons when I'd rushed past this building on my way to treat patients who needed me more than I needed sleep or rest, or time with my own family. Tell me what's happening, Henry, Jonathan said, after we'd exchanged pleasantries and settled into the comfortable leather chairs he reserved for serious conversations. I explained everything, the subtle pressure campaigns, the conversations about my competency, the real estate agent touring my property while Richard took photographs and discussed timelines. Jonathan listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad, but mostly just absorbing the full scope of what I was describing. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. How much are we talking about? He asked finally. In terms of assets, the house is worth about $800,000, according to recent assessments. Investment accounts, savings, pension funds, Probably another $1.5 million, maybe $2 million total. Jonathan whistled softly. That's serious money, Henry, enough to make people do things they might not normally consider. So you believe me? You don't think I'm just a paranoid old man imagining conspiracies. I believe you because I've seen this before. Adult children who convince themselves that they're acting in their parents' best interest while actually acting in their own financial interest. The psychology is fascinating. They genuinely believe they're being loving and protective while systematically dismantling their parents' autonomy and independence. What can I do about it? Jonathan pulled out a thick folder and spread several documents across his desk. Several things. First, we're going to set up an irrevocable trust that places all your major assets beyond anyone else's reach. The house, your investment accounts. Everything goes into the trust with you as the sole beneficiary during your lifetime and after I die. That depends on how you want to structure it. We could designate your grandchildren as ultimate beneficiaries or specific charities, or even conditional bequests that depend on your children's behavior during your remaining years. The idea of using my estate as leverage felt uncomfortable, but I was beginning to understand that playing by the old rules, assuming good faith, trusting in family loyalty, believing that love would triumph over greed, had left me vulnerable to people who weren't constrained by those same moral boundaries. What about power of attorney? Richard mentioned something about getting legal authority to make decisions for me. Jonathan's expression darkened. That's more concerning. If they can convince a court that you're mentally incompetent, they could potentially override the trust protections. We need to document your mental capacity thoroughly and put safeguards in place that would make it extremely difficult for anyone to challenge your competency over the next 2 hours. We constructed a legal fortress designed to protect me from my own children, an irrevocable trust that placed all my assets beyond their reach, a comprehensive medical evaluation that documented my mental and physical health, advanced directives that specified exactly what medical interventions I would and wouldn't accept, removing any ambiguity about my wishes, a power of attorney designation that went to Jonathan himself rather than to family members who might have conflicts of interest. There's one more thing, Jonathan said as we concluded our business. If they're serious about having you declared incompetent, they might try to doctor your medical records or bribe healthcare providers to support their case. Do you trust your current physician? I thought about Dr. Amanda Morrison, who'd taken over my care after my own retirement. She was young, competent, but I didn't know her well enough to be certain of her integrity under pressure. I'd like to recommend someone, Jonathan continued. Dr. Sarah Chen runs a geriatric practice that specializes in protecting elderly patients from exactly this kind of exploitation. She's been an expert witness in several cases involving financial elder abuse. If your children try to challenge your competency, having her as your physician would give you significant legal protection. As I left Jonathan's office that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Eleanor's death. Hope. Not the warm, encompassing hope of someone who believes the best about people and situations, but the cold, strategic hope of someone who's learned to expect the worst and prepare accordingly. The hardest part wasn't the legal, maneuvering, or the financial restructuring. The hardest part was accepting that the children I'd loved unconditionally for 4 decades were willing to betray that love for money, but Eleanor had taught me about difficult truths during her final illness. Henry, she'd said during one of our last real conversations, loving someone doesn't mean enabling their worst impulses. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is protect yourself from people who would hurt you, even if those people are your own children. I'd thought she was talking about end-of-life decisions, about not letting guilt or false hope cloud my judgment about her medical care. Now, I realized she'd been preparing me for what would come after she was gone. The transformation of my legal and financial situation was completed in 6 weeks. 6 weeks, during which Richard and Susan continued their campaign of concern and manipulation, each phone call building a stronger case for my incompetence while I quietly moved my assets beyond their reach. Dad, we've scheduled an appointment for you with Dr. Peterson, Susan announced during one of these calls in late November. He specializes in geriatric medicine, and he can help assess whether you're getting the kind of medical care you need at your age. I discovered through a quick internet search, had been disciplined twice by the state medical board for inappropriate prescribing practices, and had recently filed for bankruptcy. Exactly the kind of physician who might be willing to provide a favorable assessment in exchange for financial consideration. "I already have a doctor," I replied. "Dr. Morrison." "Daddy, she's a general practitioner. You need someone who understands the specific challenges of aging. Someone who can evaluate whether you're still capable of making complex decisions about your health and living situation." My decision-making abilities are fine, are they? Because Richard and I have been comparing notes, and we're both concerned about some of the things you've been saying lately. Talking about conspiracy theories, accusing us of trying to steal your house. Those kinds of paranoid thoughts can be early signs of cognitive decline. Paranoid thoughts, cognitive decline. They were building a medical case based on my accurate assessment of their actual behavior. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so terrifying. I'm not paranoid, sweetheart. I'm just paying attention to what? Two real estate agents touring my property without my permission. To conversations about power of attorney and forced competency evaluations, to the fact that my children seem more interested in my assets than in my well-being, Susan's voice became sharp, losing the artificial sweetness she'd been maintaining for weeks. "That's exactly what I'm talking about. Dad, you're creating these elaborate scenarios where everyone is plotting against you. It's classic paranoid behavior, and it's getting worse." After she hung up, I sat in the kitchen where Eleanor and I had shared so many meals and tried to imagine what she would say about this situation. Would she be heartbroken by our children's betrayal, or would she claim she'd seen it coming all along? I thought about the night Richard had come home from his senior year of college, drunk and angry after breaking up with his girlfriend, and had screamed at both of us about how we'd never understood him, how we'd been selfish parents who cared more about impressing other people than about his happiness. Eleanor had cried after he stormed out, but she'd also said something that had stuck with me all these years. "Henry, that boy has never learned that the world doesn't revolve around him. We gave him everything he wanted, but we never taught him to be grateful for it. Someday that's going to come back to haunt us." She'd been right, as she was about most things. We'd raised children who expected to be given whatever they wanted without having to earn it, who saw other people's resources as extensions of their own entitlement, who had never learned the difference between love and indulgence. December brought the confrontation. I'd been both dreading and anticipating. Richard and Susan arrived together on a Saturday morning, their cars pulling into my driveway like they'd coordinated their approach for maximum psychological impact. Through the front window, I watched them confer briefly on the sidewalk, clearly steeling themselves for what they expected to be a difficult conversation. I opened the door before they could knock, putting on the warm smile I'd perfected during 43 years of delivering difficult news to patients and their families. "Well, this is a nice surprise," I said, though we all knew it wasn't a surprise at all. Come in. I was just making coffee." They followed me into the kitchen, but neither of them sat down when I gestured toward the breakfast table. Instead, they remained standing, positioning themselves between me and the exit, like they were afraid I might try to escape from my own home. "We need to talk," Richard began, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone I'd heard him use with business associates over the years. "Susan and I have been discussing your situation, and we think it's time to make some serious decisions about your future." "My situation." "Your living situation," Susan clarified, though her eyes kept darting around the kitchen like she was cataloging valuable items. "Dad, this house is too much for you. The yard work, the maintenance, the isolation. It's not healthy for someone your age. I'm managing fine. Are you?" Richard pulled out his phone and began reading from what appeared to be a prepared list. "Mrs. Henderson says you've been leaving newspapers on the front porch for days at a time. The mail carrier mentioned to Susan that you haven't been bringing in your mail regularly. The lawn service called because you forgot to pay there. Invoice for 3 months. Each accusation was technically true, but completely lacking in context. The newspapers had piled up during the week when I'd had the flu and hadn't felt like venturing outside. The mail issue had occurred when the postal service changed delivery times without notice. The lawn service invoice had been misfiled. Nothing more serious than the kind of clerical error anyone might make. But I could see how these isolated incidents might be woven together to create a narrative of declining competence, especially if presented to a judge or medical professional who didn't know me. Personally, sometimes retired people have different priorities than younger folks, I said mildly. Sometimes we care less about rigid schedules and more about comfort and peace of mind. "This isn't about schedules," Susan said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone she probably used with opposing counsel who weren't sophisticated enough to understand complex legal concepts. "This is about safety. What if you have a medical emergency and can't get to the phone? What if you fall down those stairs and lie there for days before anyone finds you? What if a meteor hits the house? What if aliens abduct me from the front yard?" We could spend all day discussing unlikely scenarios. But that doesn't mean I should restructure my entire life around remote possibilities. Richard and Susan exchanged a look. One of those wordless communications that siblings perfect over decades of shared experience. I recognized the expression because I'd seen it countless times before. The look that meant they'd decided I was being unreasonable and needed to be handled rather than listened to. "The thing is, Dad," Richard said, "we've found a perfect solution. Sunset Gardens has an opening in its independent living section. It's beautiful, really your own apartment. Restaurant-quality meals, activities, and medical staff available around the clock. And the best part is, they're offering a significant discount if you move in before the end of the year." "How generous of them." "We've already filled out the application," Susan added, pulling a thick folder from her purse. "All you need to do is sign, and we can have you moved in within 2 weeks. In time for Christmas, so you won't have to spend the holidays alone in this big, empty house." They'd filled out the application without consulting me. They'd made plans for my future, my home, and now they were presenting their decisions as if I were a child who needed their guidance to make appropriate choices. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at Eleanor's garden, now dormant under a light covering of snow, but still beautiful in its winter stillness. She'd planned that garden to provide color and interest in every season. Understanding that beauty wasn't just about spring flowers and summer abundance, but about finding grace in the quiet months too. "I'm not moving to Sunset Gardens," I said quietly, without turning away from the window. "Dad, you're not thinking clearly about this," Richard said, his voice gaining an edge of impatience. "We're offering you a perfect solution to all the problems you're going to face living alone. Medical care, social interaction, professional maintenance, security, everything you need in one convenient package. Everything I need except my autonomy, my memories, and my right to make decisions about my own life." "Your right to make decisions?" Susan's voice rose toward the shrill tone she'd developed during law school arguments. "Dad, you're 78 years old, and you're not making good decisions. The unpaid bills, the neglected yard, the social isolation. These are warning signs that you're not capable of managing independently anymore." I turned from the window to face my children, these two people I'd loved more than my own life for 4 decades, and saw something in their eyes that chilled me more than the December wind rattling the kitchen windows. They weren't looking at me with love or concern or even genuine worry. They were looking at me like I was an obstacle to be overcome, a problem to be solved, a resource to be managed. "Let me ask you something," I said, my voice carrying the same calm authority I'd used in emergency rooms when critical decisions needed to be made quickly and clearly. "What happens to this house after I move to Sunset Gardens?" Another exchange of looks, another moment of silent communication that excluded me from my own life decisions. "Well, obviously it would need to be sold," Richard said, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "Dad, you can't maintain 2 residences, and the equity in this house would pay for your care at Sunset Gardens for years to come. And who would handle this sale? We would, of course. Susan and I would take care of all the details, listing it with a realtor, managing the showings, and handling the closing. You wouldn't need to worry about any of that." "How considerate of you, Dad." "What's with the sarcasm?" Susan asked. "We're trying to help you, and you're acting like we're the enemy. Are you helping me? Or are you helping yourselves to my assets while convincing yourselves that it's for my own good?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering for months. Richard's face flushed red with anger or embarrassment, while Susan's eyes filled with tears that might have been genuine or might have been performance. "Art, that's a terrible thing to say," Susan whispered. "Dad, we love you. Everything we're suggesting is because we want what's best for you. Do you? Then let me make my own choices about where and how I want to live. Let me decide whether I'm ready to leave the home your mother and I built together. Let me determine what's best for my own life." "But you're not making good choices," Richard insisted. "That's the whole point. Your judgment is compromised by grief and age and isolation. Someone needs to step in and make rational decisions before you hurt yourself or end up in an even worse situation. My judgment is fine. What's compromised is your ability to see me as anything other than an inconvenient obstacle to your inheritance. The words were out before I could stop them. The truth I'd been dancing around for months finally spoken aloud in my own kitchen. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the tick of the antique clock Eleanor had inherited from her grandmother. The same clock that had marked the hours of our marriage, our children's childhood, the quiet decades of our life together. "How dare you?" Richard said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "How dare you accuse us of caring about money when we're trying to protect you from yourself?" Protect me from what? From living in my own home, from making my own decisions, from having control over assets I spent 43 years accumulating, from dying alone and forgotten in this mausoleum. Susan shot back, her lawyer instincts finally overriding her daughter's facade. "Dad, you're living in the past, clinging to memories of someone dead for 8 months. Mom is gone, and she's not coming back. And pretending that staying in this house somehow keeps her alive is just pathological grief that's preventing you from accepting reality." The cruelty of it took my breath away, not just the words themselves, but the calculated way they were delivered, designed to inflict maximum emotional damage while positioning herself as the voice of reason and mental health. "Your mother isn't gone from this house," I said quietly. "She's in every room, every piece of furniture, every photograph on every wall. She's in the garden she planned, and the kitchen where she cooked our meals, and the bedroom where we shared 45 years of marriage. Leaving this house would be abandoning her, and I won't do that." "Dad, that's exactly the kind of thinking that proves you need professional help," Richard said, pulling out his phone. "Dr. Peterson is expecting your call. He can evaluate whether you're competent to make these kinds of major life decisions, and if not, Susan and I can petition the court for guardianship that would allow us to make the necessary arrangements for your care. The legal mechanism that would strip me of all autonomy, all rights, all control over my own existence." They were threatening to have me declared mentally incompetent unless I voluntarily surrendered everything I'd worked for to their management. "I don't think that will be necessary," I said. Walking to the kitchen counter where I'd placed a manila folder that morning, knowing this confrontation was inevitable, Susan asked, her eyes narrowing with the suspicious alertness she'd developed during years of courtroom battles. "This is a letter from Dr. Sarah Chen, a geriatrician who specializes in elder care and mental health assessments. She conducted a comprehensive evaluation of my cognitive and physical condition last week, including psychological testing, memory assessments, and medical examinations." I opened the folder and withdrew the official letterhead, letting them see the professional formatting and medical credentials that gave weight to every word. "Dr. Chen concludes that I am in excellent mental health, with no signs of cognitive decline, dementia, or psychological impairment that would affect my ability to make independent decisions about my medical care, financial affairs, or living situation." Richard grabbed the letter from my hands, scanning it while his face grew progressively paler. "When did you do this? Why didn't you tell us?" "I did it last Tuesday, while you thought I was getting my hair cut. And I didn't tell you because your behavior over the past few months has made it clear that you're not interested in my actual well-being, only in finding justifications for taking control of my life." Susan snatched the letter from her brother, her legal training allowing her to quickly identify the key phrases in official language that made this document legally bulletproof. "This doesn't change anything," she said, though her voice lacked the confidence she'd displayed moments earlier. "Dad, one doctor's opinion doesn't override obvious signs that you're struggling to manage your affairs. Independently, one doctor's opinion. Let me show you something else." I withdrew another document from the folder, this one bearing the letterhead of Pierce & Associates, Jonathan's law firm. "This is a comprehensive evaluation conducted by an attorney who specializes in elder law and competency issues. He spent 4 hours interviewing me, reviewing my financial records, and assessing my ability to understand and manage complex legal and business matters. The legal assessment was even more thorough than the medical evaluation, documenting my understanding of contract law, financial planning, estate management, and decision-making processes. Jonathan had been characteristically thorough, creating a document that would be nearly impossible for any court to dismiss or challenge. He concludes that I possess full legal capacity to make decisions about all aspects of my personal and financial affairs, and that any attempt to challenge this capacity based on age discrimination or family pressure would likely constitute elder abuse under state law. The transformation in my children's demeanor was remarkable to watch. The confident authority they displayed while discussing my incompetence and their plans for my future evaporated like morning mist, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. "Dad, we never meant," Susan began, but I held up my hand to stop her. "There's more." I withdrew the final document from the folder, which one thick enough to represent the comprehensive legal restructuring Jonathan and I had implemented over the past 6 weeks. This is the Eleanor Margaret Caldwell Memorial Trust, an irrevocable trust that now holds all of my major assets, the house, my investment accounts, my savings, my pension funds, everything. Richard's hands shook as he flipped through the pages, trying to comprehend the legal language that had just destroyed their carefully planned future. "What does this mean?" he asked, though his voice suggested he already knew. "It means that I no longer own anything. The trust owns all of my assets, and I am the sole beneficiary during my lifetime. When I die, everything goes directly to your children, my grandchildren, not to you." The silence that followed was different from the earlier tension. This wasn't the quiet of people gathering their thoughts or planning their next arguments. This was the silence of people watching their dreams collapse in real time, of realizing that the future they'd counted on had just been snatched away by the very person they'd been planning to manipulate. "You can't do this," Susan whispered, tears streaming down her face now with what appeared to be genuine devastation. "Dad, we're your children. We're your family. You can't just disinherit us because we made some mistakes." "I haven't disinherited you, sweetheart. I've protected myself from you." "There's a difference. This is insane," Richard exploded, throwing the trust documents on the kitchen table with enough force to scatter the pages. "Dad, you've let paranoid delusions drive you to destroy your own family over money that we never even wanted in the first place. Never wanted. Then you should be relieved that it's going to people who will appreciate it more." "We wanted to help you," Susan sobbed. "We were trying to make sure you were safe and cared for. And you've turned that into some kind of conspiracy theory about us stealing from you." I looked at my daughter, my youngest child who'd once been so tender-hearted she couldn't bear to see injured animals, and wondered if she actually believed what she was saying, or if the lies had become so deeply embedded that she'd lost track of her own motivations. "3 days ago, you called Mrs. Henderson to ask her to document my strange behavior for a potential competency hearing. Last week, Richard contacted Dr. Peterson to discuss what testimony would be needed to have me declared mentally incompetent. 2 weeks ago, you both toured my house with a real estate agent and discussed listing strategies. Their faces went white as I recited the evidence of their conspiracy, the documentation Jonathan and I had gathered through private investigators and legal discovery processes. You weren't trying to help me. You were trying to steal from me while convincing yourselves that it was an act of love. The saddest part is that I think you actually believed your own justifications." I walked to the kitchen drawer where Eleanor had always kept her important papers and withdrew one final document, a handwritten letter on my personal stationery. "This is a letter I wrote to both of you 3 days ago. Before I knew how this conversation would go, I want you to hear what I thought about you then. Before you showed me exactly who you've become." I unfolded the letter, my hands steady despite the emotional weight of the moment, and began to read. "My dear Richard and Susan, I am writing this to tell you how proud I am of the adults you've become, how grateful I am for the love and support you've shown me since your mother's death, and how confident I am that the values Eleanor and I tried to instill in you will guide you through whatever challenges life brings." My voice caught slightly as I read, the words I'd written in hope rather than certainty, the letter I'd composed before I knew how completely they'd betrayed my trust. "I want you to know that everything I've worked for, everything your mother and I built together, has always been intended for you and your children. Not because you're entitled to it, but because you're the living legacy of our love, the proof that our marriage created something beautiful and lasting that will outlive both of us." Susan was crying harder now, great, gasping sobs that shook her entire body. Richard stood motionless, his face a mask of shock and something that might have been shame. But that letter was written by a man who still believed that his children loved him more than they loved his money. The conversation we've just had has shown me that man was living in a fantasy. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the drawer, then turned to face the two people who had just taught me the most painful lesson of my 78 years. The trust is irrevocable, which means I can't change it even if I wanted to. Your inheritance is gone, not because I'm cruel or vindictive, but because you've shown me that you can't be trusted with the legacy your mother and I worked so hard to create. Dad? Please, Richard said, his voice breaking on the words. Don't do this to us. Don't destroy our family over a misunderstanding. I'm not destroying our family, son. You did that when you decided that my house was worth more to you than my happiness. When you conspired to have me declared incompetent. When you chose to see me as an obstacle to your financial security rather than as a father who deserved your love and respect. The confrontation was over, though none of us seemed ready to acknowledge it. Richard and Susan stood in my kitchen like mourners at a funeral, grieving the death of dreams they'd never had the right to dream in the first place. What happens now? Susan asked finally. Now, you leave, I said quietly. You go back to your lives, your careers, your families. You stop trying to manage my affairs or manipulate my decisions. You accept that I'm capable of taking care of myself and that my choices about my own life are mine to make. And if we don't, I gestured toward the trust documents scattered on the table. Then Jonathan has copies of every recording, every photograph, every piece of evidence documenting your conspiracy to defraud me. Elder abuse is a felony in this state, and attempting to have someone declared incompetent for financial gain can result in criminal charges as well as civil penalties. The threat was clear, delivered without anger or malice, but with the same clinical precision. I'd once used to explain terminal diagnoses to patients' families. They could choose to accept the new reality, or they could face the legal consequences of their attempted betrayal. Richard was the first to move, gathering up the scattered papers with hands that trembled slightly from shock or rage or embarrassment. Susan followed his lead, collecting her purse and coat with the mechanical movements of someone operating on autopilot at the front door. She turned back toward me one final time. I love you, Daddy, she said, her voice small and broken. Despite everything that's happened, despite all the mistakes we've both made, I love you. I looked at my youngest child, my daughter, who'd once believed that love could heal any wound and fix any problem, and felt my heart break for both of us. I know you do, sweetheart, but love isn't enough when it comes with conditions, when it's mixed with greed and manipulation. That's not love, that's something else entirely. Something that hurts everyone it touches. After they left, I stood in my front hallway surrounded by 45 years of memories and listened to the house settle round me with its familiar creaks and sighs. The silence felt different. No, not empty, but peaceful. The constant tension of wondering when the next manipulation would come, the exhausting vigilance of protecting myself from people who should have been protecting me, was finally over. That evening, I poured myself a glass of Eleanor's favorite wine and sat in her chair by the fireplace. Watching the flames dance across the logs, I'd split myself in the backyard where she'd once grown roses. The wine tasted sweeter than I remembered, or maybe I was finally tasting it without the bitter accompaniment of betrayal and disappointment. The photo albums were always kept on the lowest shelf of the bookcase, where Eleanor could easily reach them when the mood struck to revisit our shared history. I pulled out the oldest one, bound in white leather and filled with pictures from our courtship and early marriage, and let myself remember what it felt like to believe that love was simple, that family was forever, that good people naturally did good things. There we were on our wedding day, Eleanor radiant in her grandmother's dress and me looking impossibly young in my father's suit. There were the first photos of baby Richard red-faced and screaming in the hospital nursery, and Susan 3 years later, peaceful and perfect in Eleanor's arms. Pictures of birthday parties and Christmas mornings and family vacations to places we couldn't really afford but somehow managed to visit anyway. I lingered on a photograph taken during Richard's high school graduation, all 4 of us smiling in front of the auditorium where he'd just delivered the valedictorian speech. Eleanor and I looked so proud, so confident that we'd raised a son who would make a positive difference in the world. Susan, barely 15 then, gazed at her big brother with undisguised admiration. Clearly believing he was destined for greatness, had we failed them somehow? Had we been so focused on providing material advantages that we forgot to teach them about character and integrity and the difference between love and entitlement? Or had they simply made their own choices as adults, choices that reflected values we'd never intended to instill? I closed the album and walked to the kitchen window where I'd stood that morning, looking out at Eleanor's garden. The snow had stopped, and moonlight illuminated the dormant flower beds where her perennials waited patiently for spring. She'd planned that garden to be beautiful in every season, understanding that true beauty wasn't about constant bloom, but about grace and dignity, even in the quiet months. 6 months passed before I heard from either of my children again. 6 months of peace, of learning to live with the knowledge that I'd chosen dignity over family harmony, justice over false reconciliation. I filled my days with reading, with volunteer work at the free clinic downtown, with tending Eleanor's garden as it awakened from winter sleep. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in June. Addressed in Susan's careful handwriting to Dr. Henry Caldwell rather than Dad, a formality that somehow hurt more than all the anger and accusations that had preceded it. "Dear Father," it began, and I could hear the lawyer in every precisely chosen word. "Richard and I have had time to reflect on the events of last December, and we want you to know that we understand why you felt it necessary to protect yourself from what you perceived as a threat to your autonomy and financial security. What I perceived as a threat, even in their apology, they couldn't quite admit the reality of what they'd attempted. We recognize that our approach to your living situation may have seemed presumptuous or controlling, and we sincerely regret any pain or distress our actions may have caused you. It may have caused the language of lawyers and politicians, crafted to convey regret without admitting guilt or accepting responsibility. However, we also hope you can understand that our motivations were genuinely rooted in concern for your welfare. Watching you struggle with grief and isolation after Mom's death was heartbreaking for us, and perhaps we allowed our fear for your safety to override our respect for your independence. There it was, the careful rewriting of history that transformed their greed into love, their betrayal into misguided protection. They were offering me a narrative that would allow us all to pretend the previous 6 months hadn't revealed fundamental truths about who they'd become. If you would be willing to meet with us to discuss the possibility of rebuilding our relationship, we would welcome the opportunity to move forward as a family. We miss you, Dad, and we hope there's still a chance for reconciliation." The letter was signed by both of them, though I could tell Susan had written it. Richard had always been more direct, more willing to confront difficult truths head-on. This careful, diplomatic language was pure Susannan attempt to achieve, through legal maneuvering, what they'd failed to accomplish through emotional manipulation. Set the letter aside and walked out to Eleanor's garden, where the roses she'd planted were beginning their second bloom of the season. She'd always said that the June flowers were lovely, but the September roses were more precious because they bloomed despite knowing that winter was coming, that their time was limited, that each petal was a gift stolen from the approaching cold. I called Jonathan to discuss my options. "They want reconciliation on their terms," I explained. "They're not admitting they did anything wrong, just suggesting that maybe their approach was imperfect. They want me to pretend the last 6 months never happened so we can all go back to playing happy family." "What do you want to do?" Jonathan asked. I thought about Eleanor's September roses, about the grace of accepting reality without bitterness, about the difference between forgiveness and enabling bad behavior. "I want to write them a letter," I said finally. "One last letter that tells them exactly where we stand and what kind of relationship, if any, might be possible going forward." That evening, I sat at Eleanor's writing desk and tried to find words that were honest without being cruel, clear without being vindictive. It took me 3 drafts to get it right, 3 attempts to balance love with boundaries, hope with realism. "My dear Richard and Susan," I wrote, "thank you for your letter. I appreciate your desire to rebuild our relationship, and I want you to know that I still love you both despite everything that has happened between us. The truth, simply stated. Love didn't disappear just because trust had been shattered, though it certainly changed form, however. I need you to understand that reconciliation isn't possible unless it's built on honesty about what actually occurred last year. You didn't make mistakes in approach or style. You conspired to steal my autonomy, my home, and my assets while convincing yourselves that you were acting out of love. I paused in my writing, watching the summer evening light fade across Eleanor's garden, and tried to imagine what she would want me to say to our children. Would she counsel forgiveness and fresh starts? Or would she remind me that enabling destructive behavior wasn't an act of love? The trust I established is irrevocable, and my decision to protect my assets from both of you is final. Your inheritance is gone, not because I'm vindictive, but because you've shown me that you can't be trusted with the legacy Eleanor and I worked so hard to create, the hardest part to write, but also the most necessary. They needed to understand that consequences were permanent, that some betrayals couldn't be undone through apologies and good intentions. That said, if you genuinely want a relationship with your father, not with his bank account, but with the man who raised you and still loves you despite everything, then I'm willing to try. But that relationship would have to be built on respect for my autonomy, acceptance of my decisions about my own life, and recognition that I'm capable of managing my affairs without your supervision or interference. I signed the letter simply Dad and mailed it the next morning. Knowing it might be the last communication I ever had with my children, their response came 2 weeks later. A brief note that was even more formal than their first attempt at reconciliation. We cannot accept the terms you've outlined, as they require us to pretend that our legitimate concerns about your welfare were somehow improper. We will always love you, but we cannot participate in a relationship that demonizes our efforts to help you while ignoring the reality of your situation. My situation. Even in their final rejection, they couldn't resist implying that I was the one with problems, the one whose judgment was questionable, the one who needed their help whether I wanted it or not. I folded their letter and placed it in Eleanor's writing desk, next to the trust documents and medical evaluations, and all the other papers that documented the end of one chapter of my life and the beginning of another. That was 3 years ago. 3 years of silence from the children I raised, 3 years of holidays spent alone, 3 years of learning that solitude isn't the same as loneliness when you're surrounded by memories of genuine love rather than the echoes of manipulation and betrayal. The grandchildren have reached out occasionally, brief messages on birthdays and Christmas that suggest they don't fully understand what happened between their parents and me, but still remember the grandfather who taught them to fish and told them stories and believed in their potential to become good people. Emma is applying to medical school now, following in her grandfather's footsteps in a way that gives me hope that something positive might emerge from the ashes of this family tragedy. I've learned to find peace in my daily routines, in the volunteer work that connects me with people who still need healing, in the garden where Eleanor's roses continue to bloom each summer, despite knowing that winter always returns. The house no longer feels too large for one person because it's filled with the presence of someone who truly loved me, someone who knew the difference between caring for a person and controlling them. Sometimes, in the quiet evening hours when the shadows grow long across Eleanor's garden, I wonder if I made the right choice. Would it have been better to accept their manipulations, to let them warehouse me in some facility while they sold off the life Eleanor and I built together? Would it have been kinder to preserve the illusion of family harmony rather than insist on the uncomfortable truth of what they'd become? But then I remember the look in their eyes that December morning, the way they'd spoken about my house and my assets and my future as if I were already dead, as if my wishes and feelings were irrelevant obstacles to their financial planning. I remember the calculated cruelty of their attempts to have me declared incompetent, the professional assessments they'd sought from corrupt doctors, the legal strategies they'd discussed for overriding my autonomy, and I know that I chose correctly. Not the easy choice, not the choice that would have preserved the appearance of family unity, but the choice that honored Eleanor's memory and my own dignity. The choice that said, some things matter more than keeping peace with people who would destroy you for profit, even if those people happen to share your blood. They say that family is forever, that blood is thicker than water, that parents should love their children unconditionally, no matter how badly those children behave. But Eleanor taught me during her final illness that love without boundaries isn't really love at all it's enabling. It's codependency. It's the kind of false kindness that ultimately hurts everyone it touches. Real love sometimes requires difficult choices. It requires protecting yourself from people who would harm you, even when those people are your own children. It requires choosing dignity over harmony, truth over comfortable illusions, Justice over false peace. I am Dr. Henry Caldwell, 78 years old, living alone in the house that love built. My children chose money over family, greed over loyalty, manipulation over respect. They tried to steal my life while convincing themselves they were saving it, but they couldn't steal my dignity. They couldn't break my spirit. They couldn't make me forget the difference between genuine love and calculated exploitation, and in the end, surrounded by Eleanor's roses and the memories of a marriage built on real devotion rather than selfish ambition. That's enough. It has to be enough. Because it's all I have left, and sometimes all you have left is all you need.